Have you ever found yourself face to face with a police officer? Your heart is racing. You're unsure what to say or do. While most police interactions are just routine, they can quickly spiral into something much more serious. Suddenly, you're not just a person talking to a police officer, you're now a suspect. Now, what if I told you that you could now get rid of those nerves and handle yourself perfectly when interacting with law enforcement? In today's video, I'll show you how to talk to cops like a seasoned lawyer, making sure your rights are protected every step of the way. If you wait around till the end of the video, I'll give you a checklist of 6 pointers for you to follow in different situations if you encounter the police. Now, here is the never-changing rule when it comes to police. If you choose to give a statement to the police, you will now be locked in to that statement. Any deviations or variations from that original statement will now likely be interpreted by the cops as you lying or covering up the truth. Why didn't you tell us this earlier? Are you changing your story now? What exactly are you hiding? By the way, do you know that if you change your report now and your statement, you could be charged with a false report to a peace officer? Because of this, you should never just start talking to the police. Opening your mouth and spewing out the first thing that's in your head, layered with emotions in the moment, is one of the worst things you can possibly do with the police in any situation. Why is this a problem? Because the reality of it is you never just get to say what you want to say. What starts as you telling your story to the police always turns into an interrogation. The cops start asking you a lot of very direct, closed-ended questions. Maybe you're sharing your story. The next thing they say is, how many punches did you throw? How many times did you say you pushed him? Cops are actually staring at the physical evidence in front of them. And as you begin to open your mouth and tell your story, they are comparing what you say to the evidence that they have. And if those two things don't line up, they are going to always interpret it against you as a sign of guilt. It doesn't mean you were lying or making up anything. But in this situation, it's all about what you said, how you said it, and how the cops choose to interpret what you said. And let me tell you, 9 out of 10 times, any officer or detective is trying to get you to say something incriminating or something that they can take and fit the theory of the case that they are investigating. If you want to talk to cops like a seasoned lawyer, you've got to become a pro with small talk. Whether you were involved in an altercation and you want to give your statement, or whether the police just pulled you over for a traffic stop, get ready for cop small talk. I see this happen all the time with neighbors. Let's say the neighbors call the cops on you for some dumb reason, and now the cops show up at your front door beating on your door. What do? Let me start by saying you should try and be polite and respectful to the police. But you need to stand up for your constitutional rights and protect yourself. The reason why I say you should still be polite and respectful to the police is that if you start to elevate your level of discussion and maybe you start to elevate your anger, your tone of voice, you are going to also escalate the situation with the police and things could get out of control very quickly. Most cops will show up at your front door trying to be nice and accommodating to you. But be careful, this is their normal routine because they want you to open up and start answering their questions. If your neighbor called 911 on you, be aware of the fact, in my experience, cops have a tendency to believe the person who first called 911. So if your neighbor called 911, there's a decent chance that the officer has already spoken to your neighbor and they may have already labeled you the actual aggressor and your neighbor the victim. If that's the case, you're going to have a hard time talking yourself out of anything. The other problem here, cops are not required to tell you that they're investigating you. They may think you're a witness or the primary suspect. This places you at a distinct disadvantage when you choose to engage in small talk with the cops. However, the real reason cops engage in small talk with you is that they are fishing. They are fishing for you to volunteer any information that will establish probable cause so that the cops can now detain you or arrest you as the suspect. Now look, cops are expertly trained on how to do this, and they do a very good job of making you feel both safe and protected while they ask you to volunteer information based upon their questions. Cops may ask you fishing questions like this: where are you headed? Where'd you come from? Who you been hanging out with? What are you up to? Cops may ask you these fishing questions, number one, because they're hoping you'll volunteer information in order to use against you. Number two, they may actually be waiting for backup to show up so that they can make a decision to detain or arrest you. Or number three, I find cops will do this many times to hold you back and detain you long enough for a drug dog to show up and do a search around your car. Either way, you do not have to engage in small talk with the police, because small talk is a trap. Let me be clear, you do not have to give a statement or provide any answers to questions if cops are questioning you. Remember, you always have a Sixth Amendment right to an attorney, and you have a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Here's what you can say: Officer, I am happy to answer any and all questions, but I must have my attorney present under the Sixth Amendment, and I will exercise my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent until my attorney arrives. After you say this, keep your mouth closed and say no more. Now, I get a lot of pushback when I give this as potential advice. Why? Because many people say, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide, why can't I just talk to the police? Here's the problem. Do you really want to trust your freedom and your clear criminal record to a police officer who may have already formed an opinion that they believe you are their primary suspect, and anything you say to this officer will now be potentially twisted, manipulated, and formed to fit their theory of the case, which would involve you going to jail? You might say, but yeah, what if it's a good detective? What if the guy's honest? But let me ask you a question. Have you ever been misunderstood by someone? All of us have thought someone was one thing, and then we learned they were something completely different. In my experience, police have a tendency to quickly label people as either suspects or victims. If they make a snap judgment against you, you can guarantee that not only the things that you say, but also the things you don't say, like your body language and maybe your hesitation to answer a question because maybe you're just thinking about it, all of that will now be written down through the lens of them interpreting it based on their label of you. And what do you think is going to happen? Now, do you think that a judge or a jury is now going to believe the officer or you if it goes to trial? Look, detectives are trained. Once they think they have a theory of a case, if they believe you're the bad guy, they're going to take all the evidence, and especially the things that you say, and they are now going to put it within the puzzle pieces of the framework of it pointing to you as being guilty. In fact, the statistics on this are crazy. The overwhelming majority of convictions during a jury trial are based upon someone giving a voluntary statement, trying to explain themselves and what happened in a situation, and then the cops take that along with the prosecutors and they compare it against other evidence to try to make that person, you being cooperative, try to take that information you volunteered to make it look like you're either hiding something, that you're lying, or that you're just flat out guilty. So remember, when a police officer is acting very nice and engaging in a lot of small talk with you, they may have ulterior motives. Stay quiet. What if you find yourself in a situation where you acted in self-defense? Part of learning how to talk to cops like a lawyer is learning to be a pro when you claim self-defense. One of the biggest mistakes I find people making in self-defense situations is that as soon as the police show up, they just start talking to the officers and answering any and all questions. I mean, think about it. You were just in the middle of a self-defense situation, your emotions are running high, and what if you end up hesitating for a moment, or maybe you're confused by the question from the police officer? I want you to understand, the officer is going to be interpreting whatever you say, and he's going to interpret it negatively if it doesn't meet the officer's expectations. In fact, many times, if the officers show up and that individual remains quiet, they remained silent, even if the case were to go to trial later, many times they are found not guilty. Why? Because in a self-defense case, the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that what you did was not self-defense. They must actually prove a negative to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you did not act in self-defense. In many self-defense cases, proving that you did not act reasonably and did not act in self-defense can be a very difficult thing for prosecutors to do, unless you open your mouth. And if you just start answering a bunch of questions, you're placing yourself under the microscope of scrutiny where people will judge you for every little thing you said and did not say. What do the pros and lawyers do in this situation? No statement at all when the police first arrive. You should remain polite and calm, but exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and your Sixth Amendment right to counsel, and do not give a statement whatsoever until you've consulted with a lawyer. You say, yeah, but man, I don't have the money to hire a lawyer. Well, remember, under the Constitution, you have the right to an appointed attorney. It's part of the Miranda rights. We all know this. And even though you may say, well, look, that's not the cream of the crop if I end up with an appointed attorney, I can promise you this. It's better to have an appointed attorney giving you advice about a statement than trying to go at it alone. Sometimes the old saying, nobody talks and everybody walks, can be true. But if I ask for an attorney and I exercise my right to remain silent, won't they use that against me? Absolutely not. Now look, I get it. Police are trained to make you feel bad by exercising your rights. They want to make you feel guilty because you're not cooperating with them. But there is absolutely nothing they can do about you choosing to exercise your constitutional rights, and it is nothing more than a tactic to try to get you to open up. On a self-defense claim, it's really important to have your lawyer come and assess all the evidence. Take a look at what the cops claim they have against you. Then they can advise you on crafting a short, well-advised statement that makes it clear that you've asserted your self-defense, but at the same time, make sure it cannot be misinterpreted or misapplied to the evidence. Look, talking to cops without a lawyer present and without being able to review their so-called evidence is an unfair fight you are not well equipped to win. So what if you realize the police are coming after you? What if you know you're supposed to remain silent? Can you just ignore cops if they keep asking you questions? The answer to this depends upon the context. Let's take the first example. Let's say you're just walking down the road and cops walk up to you and start asking you questions. Technically, this is known as a voluntary encounter. It is considered a voluntary encounter because the cops presumably do not have any reasonable suspicion or any probable cause that you've done anything wrong. They're just walking up to you and asking you questions. So it's completely voluntary. That means it's no different than any stranger who might walk up to you as you're walking down the street and they just start asking you questions. Are you allowed to ignore a stranger if they start talking to you? Could you just walk away from them? Yes, you can. Now, it might seem rude or not in alignment with social practice or social norms, but it is by no means illegal to ignore someone. Does that mean I can ignore cops if they walk up to me too? Technically, yes. It's a good chance that cops are going to get offended and they might be rude to you if you choose to ignore them. But legally, you can absolutely ignore a police officer if they just walk up to you and start asking you random questions. Not only can you ignore the police in a voluntary encounter, you can also walk away. If the cops have nothing, then they can do nothing and you can leave. You say, Jeff, I'm confused. How do I know the difference between a voluntary encounter and an encounter where the police claim they have some evidence against me? Well, the best way to find out to determine if it's a voluntary encounter is you don't have to answer any of the questions from the police officer, but you can say one thing. You can say, am I free to leave? Only ask that question, nothing else. They will either say, no, you're not free to leave, which means what? It means you're now under investigation and you know you need to be exercising your rights even more. Or they'll say, yes, you are free to leave and you can turn around and walk away. Now, I promised you if you waited around to the end of this video, I was going to give you 6 main points for exactly what to do, some quick hits if you end up in a particular situation with the police. Number 1, what if cops come to your door? Don't answer the door. Make the cops either get a search warrant or an arrest warrant, and always exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and your Sixth Amendment right to counsel if they come in the door. Number 2, cops pull you over for a traffic stop. Provide your driver's license, your proof of insurance, and valid registration, which is required by most states, and then tell the officer, Officer, I exercise my right to remain silent, and then say these words, Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go? Police are not legally allowed to hold you for an unreasonable period of time during a traffic stop. And by using those magic words, you're making it crystal clear you are not voluntarily sitting around and waiting for them to do more investigation. Number 3, what if you're a passenger in a car? If you are a passenger, you do not have to answer any questions of the police officer, and in most states, you do not have to provide your identification. Why? Because the only reasonable suspicion the cop had to pull over the car was for the driver and not for you. Make sure to check your state laws on this, but as always, exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Number 4, a self-defense 911 call. If you're making a 911 call for a self-defense situation, the only thing you need to be thinking about telling that 911 operator is that you need police out there immediately and that you were afraid you were going to die. Saying you were afraid you were going to die helps establish a firm foundation for a claim of self-defense because it absolutely establishes that you were in fear for your life and it doesn't require you to have to say anything more. Number 5, a self-defense situation where a cop wants you to give a statement. Like we said earlier, be careful here. You can make it clear that you were afraid you were going to die and that you were willing to provide a full statement after consulting with your attorney, which is your Sixth Amendment right. Whatever you do, exercise your Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights in this situation. Otherwise, the police are likely going to take your words, twist and manipulate them, and you could end up being labeled the aggressor, and the cops will use your words to land you in jail. Number 6, what if you're in a neighbor dispute where the cops show up to question you? Like we said earlier, you do not have to answer the door if you are in your home. The cops must either have an arrest warrant or a search warrant to enter in. But what if you're standing outside and the cops approach you? In that situation, if the cops claim they have probable cause based on what your neighbor said, I would say it's important for you to exercise your Fifth and Sixth Amendment constitutional rights and don't give any statement unless you have your lawyer present. Look, none of us want to engage in a situation where we have to talk to police officers. But if we find ourselves in that situation, use these 6 pointers, protect yourself, and always exercise your constitutional rights. Now, what if the police continue to push you and accuse you of doing something wrong even after you have exercised your right to remain silent? Check out this next video where I break down 5 ways to outsmart the police when they refuse to quit bothering you. See you over there.